All right, guys, so this is an awkward way to teach graphing, but we're going to make a go of it. So aggregate supply and demand is similar to supply and demand, but it's better. I also think you guys will find this a little easier than basic supply and demand. So when we looked at regular supply and demand, this is what we did with micro, right? This is what we've already learned. This is looking at individual items, individual markets. So like when we did just graphing for milk or just graphing for pumpkin spice lattes, right? That's micro. When we look at aggregate supply and demand, the word aggregate means total. This is where we get the macro idea. So we're looking at the total goods and services, demand for every product and every service for the entire country in that year. All right, so total demand for aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is our GDP, right? This is GDP on a graph. Don't remember, GDP is C plus I plus G plus XN, right? Consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, and net exports. Okay, so when we look at the graph, couple changes here. Instead of price, like we had in micro, we have price level. Remember, we're not just looking at the price of a single item, we are looking at the overall price level, and this will be our indicator of inflation, right? Our downward curve, just like before, aggregate demand, AD. On our x-axis, we have real GDP, and remember we say real because it has been adjusted for inflation, okay? Just like with regular supply and demand, with aggregate demand, if there's an increase, it will shift to the right. If it's a decrease, it will shift to the left. Because aggregate demand is GDP, the only things that can make this shift are the components of GDP, okay? So if you come down here, consumption spending, right? That's our C. So if consumer spending increases, GDP increases, which means aggregate demand increases. If consumer spending decreases, aggregate demand will decrease and shift to the left. All right, consumer confidence in the economy is a big part of this, right? Right now, people are freaking out because of coronavirus and the stock market is plunging, right? We don't have confidence in our economy currently, so we are going to see a leftward shift in aggregate demand. The other thing that can change is taxes, right? If the government raises taxes, then we don't have as much money and we can't spend as much money, aggregate demand goes down. It would be the opposite, obviously, if the government were to decrease income taxes, right? What comes out of our paycheck, if they decrease it, bigger paycheck, more spending. Right? Investment spending can be a component for aggregate demand and GDP. However, it is not common. Typically, when we see business information, it will end up being aggregate supply and not aggregate demand, but it is possible, but it's rare. Okay? Government spending is another common one. Obviously, if the government is spending more money, aggregate demand will increase. If government decreases spending, it will decrease just like we did with GDP last week. Okay? The last one, net exports, right? XN, net exports. If we are importing, then we will decrease our GDP because our money is going outside the country, which means aggregate demand will shift to the left. If we are exporting, we will increase our GDP, which increases aggregate demand because that money is coming into our country. So imports bad, exports good. Okay. For aggregate supply, instead of being the total demand, it is our total production. This is all the things we make for the whole country, right? GDP, gross production, gross product, okay? This is our total output, right? You need to know the term output. This is how much we are producing in our country. If you look at the graph, right? Price level instead of price, real GDP down on our X, aggregate supply, upward sloping, just like supply. Okay, one thing you might see, instead of AS, you'll see SRAS, or what we call SROS. This is short run aggregate supply. We are looking at immediate changes in the market. There is a long run, although we won't learn it, so don't worry about long run. But if you see the SR in front of aggregate supply, it means short run, and it's the same thing that we're doing, but we're just calling it aggregate supply. Okay, couple things that can shift aggregate supply. The first is input cost. We talked about this with supply as well. So if something major happens in the country that affects natural resources, usually something like a natural disaster, that could affect the input cost, right? If we have a new oil supply, that's going to make input costs cheaper, and aggregate supply will increase and it will go to the right. If we have a natural disaster and a hurricane takes out our coal mining or our water supply, then obviously it will shift to the left. So how is the event affecting how much it costs to produce in our economy? Okay, the next two kind of go hand in hand. Technology, just like we talked about before, and capital investment. So really, even though business is part of GDP, a lot of times capital investment and technology are grouped, and it's usually aggregate supply. These are always going to be an increase in our supply production, right? We can make more if we do this, and anytime we increase these, that's where we get our economic growth, right? Our businesses become more productive. The last one that could affect it are going to be labor changes. There's really only two things we could see. We could either see the wages change or the labor force change. So if they say that because the baby boomers are retiring, we're going to have a decrease in our labor force, then aggregate supply would decrease. Or if wages go down, aggregate supply would increase. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Watch again and pause if you need to. Feel free to message me on Remind or on It's Learning if you have questions, and go ahead and try that practice, see how you feel about it.